August 17, 1945. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The war had ended 2 days earlier. Emperor Hirohito had spoken on the radio, his voice trembling as he announced Japan's unconditional surrender. For the first time in history, the Japanese people had heard their God Emperor speak, and what he told them shattered everything they believed: that Japan had lost, that the divine wind had failed, that the empire of the rising sun had set. In a barracks at Camp McCoy, a Japanese prisoner of war named Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto sat on his bunk, staring at his hands. He was 31 years old. He had been captured on Saipan in July 1944, pulled from a cave where he had been hiding for 3 days without food or water, ready to die rather than surrender. But American Marines had found him first, unconscious, half dead from dehydration, and instead of executing him, as he expected, as he had been trained to expect, they gave him water. That had been 14 months ago. 14 months of living in a world that made no sense, a world where the enemy fed you 3 meals a day, where they paid you for your work, where they treated you with a courtesy that felt like mockery because it contradicted everything you had been taught about what happened to prisoners of war. But now, the war was over, and Hiroshi didn't know if that made things better or worse, because according to the code he had lived by, the Bushido code that every Japanese soldier was drilled on from the moment they entered service, surrender meant death, not just physical death, but spiritual death, the death of honor, the death of everything that made you worthy of being called Japanese. A prisoner of war, in the eyes of Japanese military doctrine, was already dead. He had no family, no country, no honor. He was a ghost, a non-person, someone who should have died on the battlefield but instead chose the coward's path of survival. And yet, here Hiroshi sat, alive, breathing, eating food that prisoners weren't supposed to receive, sleeping in a bed that prisoners weren't supposed to have, being treated like a human being when he had been told, over and over again, that the Americans would torture him, mutilate him, parade him through the streets like an animal before finally killing him. None of it had happened, and that was more terrifying than any torture could have been. If stories like this matter to you, listen closely, because this is not a story about mercy. It's not about kindness. It's about the moment when everything you've been taught, every belief, every value, every truth, is revealed to be a lie, and you have to decide whether to cling to the lie or face the truth, even when the truth means admitting that you've wasted your life believing in something that never existed. This is the story of Japanese prisoners of war who crossed the Pacific believing they were going to hell, and instead found something far more disturbing: humanity, in the hands of the enemy, from people they had been taught to see as demons, and that humanity broke them in ways that war never could. History doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes, and if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the sound of men sitting in American camps, staring at the food on their plates, and wondering if they had died on the battlefield after all. Because this couldn't be real. This couldn't be captivity. This had to be some kind of elaborate torture, some psychological game designed to break them before the real suffering began. But the suffering never came, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. The camp smelled like pine and fresh-cut grass. Hiroshi had noticed it the first day he arrived, still weak from the journey across the Pacific, still expecting to be beaten or killed at any moment. But instead, he had been processed, given a number, a uniform, a bunk assignment, and then left alone. No beatings, no interrogations, just routine, work details, meals, sleep. It felt wrong. All of it. Hiroshi stood at the edge of the camp's recreation yard, watching other prisoners play baseball. Baseball, a game, as if they were school children on holiday, not soldiers who had been defeated, captured, stripped of everything that made them who they were. One of the prisoners, a young man named Takeshi, barely 22, captured on Iwo Jima, laughed as he swung at a pitch and missed. He laughed, as if there was anything in the world worth laughing about, as if survival was something to celebrate instead of something to be ashamed of. Hiroshi felt a surge of anger. These men had forgotten themselves. They had forgotten what it meant to be Japanese. They were playing games with the enemy, eating the enemy's food, accepting the enemy's charity as if it was their right. But beneath the anger was something else, something Hiroshi didn't want to name, because the truth was, he wanted to forget too. He wanted to stop carrying the weight of shame that pressed down on him every waking moment. He wanted to stop thinking about the men he had left behind on Saipan, the men who had died with honor while he had been dragged from a cave like a coward. He wanted to play baseball. He wanted to laugh. He wanted to be human again. But that would mean admitting that everything he had been taught was wrong. And Hiroshi wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. The camp administrator, a man named Captain Richard Foster, 38 years old, a former schoolteacher from Oregon, approached Hiroshi with a translator. "Lieutenant Yamamoto," Foster said through the translator, "how are you adjusting?" Hiroshi stared at him. How was he supposed to answer that? What words existed in any language to describe what he was feeling? "I don't understand," Hiroshi said finally. "What don't you understand?" "This." Hiroshi gestured at the camp, at the prisoners playing baseball, at the clean barracks and the well-stocked mess hall. "Why are you doing this?" Foster looked confused. "Doing what?" "Treating us like this. Like we're human." Foster was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you are human. The war is over. You're not our enemy anymore. You're just men who need to be taken care of until you can go home." Hiroshi shook his head. "I can't go home." "Why not?" "Because I surrendered. Because I'm alive. In Japan, there is no place for men like me." Foster's expression softened. "Then maybe Japan needs to change." Hiroshi wanted to argue, to explain that Foster didn't understand Japanese culture, Japanese honor, Japanese duty, but he didn't have the energy, so he just nodded and walked away. That night, Hiroshi lay in his bunk, listening to the sounds of the barracks, quiet conversations in Japanese, the rustle of blankets, the occasional cough, normal sounds, human sounds, sounds that prisoners of war weren't supposed to make. In the bunk next to him, Takeshi, the young man who had been playing baseball, said quietly, "Lieutenant, can I ask you something?" "What?" "Do you think we're traitors?" Hiroshi was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know. My family in Nagasaki, if they're still alive, they'll never accept me back. They'll say I should have died, that I brought shame to them." "Then why didn't you?" "Die?" "Yes." Takeshi was quiet. Then he said, "Because I wanted to live. And I don't think that makes me a coward. I think it makes me human." Hiroshi didn't respond, because he didn't know if Takeshi was right or if he was just another man trying to justify his own weakness. But deep down, beneath all the training and indoctrination and shame, Hiroshi wondered if maybe, just maybe, Takeshi had a point. They expected death. They expected torture. They expected to be treated the way Japanese forces had treated Allied prisoners, with brutality, with contempt, with the kind of dehumanization that turned men into animals. But instead, they found a system that confused them, that contradicted everything they had been taught about the Americans, about prisoners of war, about what happened to soldiers who surrendered. Japanese military training was explicit about surrender. It was forbidden. Not just discouraged, forbidden. The Imperial Japanese Army had a code, the Senjin-kun, issued in 1941, that stated clearly, "Do not suffer the shame of being taken alive as a prisoner." Death was preferable, death was honorable, surrender was the ultimate disgrace. And the training reinforced this with stories. Stories about what Americans did to prisoners. They said Americans tortured Japanese soldiers for sport, that they mutilated bodies, that they raped women, that they were savages, barbarians, demons who didn't understand honor or mercy, and many Japanese soldiers believed these stories. Because why wouldn't they? They had been told these things by their officers, by their government, by their emperor, and they had seen evidence that seemed to confirm it. Allied bombing campaigns that killed civilians, battles that left nothing but scorched earth and corpses. But what they hadn't been told, what the propaganda carefully omitted, was how Japanese forces treated their own prisoners. The Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, the countless POW camps where Allied soldiers were starved, beaten, worked to death. The thousands of prisoners who died not in battle, but in captivity, because the Japanese military saw them as less than human. Hiroshi hadn't known about any of that. He had been a soldier, not a guard. He had fought on islands, not in POW camps. But he had heard stories, rumors, whispers about camps in the Philippines, in Singapore, in Burma, and he had chosen not to ask questions, because asking questions was dangerous, and because deep down he suspected the answers would force him to confront truths he wasn't ready to face. But now, sitting in an American camp, being fed 3 meals a day, being allowed to play sports and write letters and receive medical care, Hiroshi couldn't avoid the comparison anymore. One afternoon, a Red Cross inspector visited the camp. Hiroshi watched as the man walked through the barracks, taking notes, asking prisoners if they had any complaints. It was surreal. The idea that someone cared about the welfare of prisoners of war, the idea that there were rules, international laws, protections for men who had been captured. Hiroshi approached the translator and asked, "Why does the Red Cross come here?" The translator, a Japanese-American man named George Takahashi, who had volunteered for the role, said, "To make sure you're being treated according to the Geneva Convention." What is that? It's an international treaty that sets rules for how prisoners of war should be treated, minimum standards. Things like adequate food, medical care, shelter, prohibition of torture. Hiroshi stared at him. And America follows this? Yes. Not perfectly, but yes. Did Japan follow it? George looked uncomfortable. No. Japan never ratified the Geneva Convention. Hiroshi felt something cold settle in his stomach. What does that mean? It means Japan didn't recognize those rules. So the prisoners Japan held. George trailed off, but Hiroshi understood. He thought about the stories he had heard, the whispers, the rumors. And suddenly, they took on a different weight. Because if America, the enemy, the demon, the savage, was following rules that protected prisoners, and Japan wasn't, what did that say about Japan? What did that say about him? That night Hiroshi couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, and felt the entire architecture of his worldview crumbling. Because the truth was becoming unavoidable. He had been lied to. About the Americans. About the war. About honor. And if those lies were that big, what else had he been lied to about? The breaking point came 3 weeks after the war ended. A shipment of newspapers arrived at the camp, Japanese language papers printed in California, brought in by the camp administration as part of a re-education program. The papers contained photographs, articles, testimonies from liberated Allied POWs about what they had endured in Japanese camps. Hiroshi read the articles with growing horror. The Bataan Death March. 60,000 prisoners forced to march 65 miles in tropical heat. Thousands dying from exhaustion, disease, execution. The Burma Railway. 100,000 prisoners forced to build a railway through jungle, with a death toll so high that each mile of track represented the death of 38 men. The Hell Ships. Unmarked transport vessels that carried prisoners across the Pacific, packed so tightly that men suffocated, drowned, or were killed when Allied submarines torpedoed the ships, not knowing they carried prisoners. The numbers were staggering. Of the approximately 140,000 Allied prisoners held by Japan during the war, nearly 27% died in captivity. In German camps, the death rate was around 4%. The contrast was damning. Hiroshi set down the newspaper, his hands shaking. He felt sick, not just physically, but spiritually. Because he had been part of this. He had worn the uniform. He had followed the orders. He had believed in the cause, and the cause had been built on lies and cruelty and a fundamental disregard for human life. Other prisoners were reading the papers too. Some refused to believe it. They called it propaganda. They said the Americans were lying, trying to make Japan look worse than it was. But their protests sounded hollow, even to themselves, because deep down they knew it was true. They had heard the stories. They had seen the treatment of Chinese prisoners, of Korean laborers, of anyone who wasn't Japanese, and therefore wasn't fully human. Takeshi sat down next to Hiroshi, holding one of the newspapers. His face was pale. "Is this real?" he asked. "I think so," Hiroshi said quietly. "But we were told the Americans were the savages, that they were the ones who didn't follow the rules of war. We were told a lot of things." Takeshi looked like he was going to cry. "What does this mean?" "It means we were the monsters," Hiroshi said. "We were the savages, and we never even knew it." The realization spread through the camp like a virus. Some prisoners fell into depression, refusing to eat, refusing to work. Others became angry, lashing out at the guards, at each other, at anyone who represented the lies they had been fed. A few tried to commit suicide, not out of honor, but out of despair. Because how do you live with the knowledge that everything you believed was backwards? That you fought for evil, thinking it was good? Captain Foster called a camp-wide meeting. Through translators, he addressed the prisoners. "I know what you've been reading. I know it's difficult. But you need to understand something. You were soldiers. You followed orders. That doesn't make you responsible for the policies of your government. You were lied to, the same way millions of Germans were lied to. The question now is not what you did. It's what you do next." One prisoner, an older man, a sergeant who had fought since the invasion of China, stood up and shouted in broken English, "What we do next? We are dead! We have no honor! We cannot go home! What we do?" Foster looked at him with something that resembled compassion. "You live! You learn! You make sure the next generation doesn't make the same mistakes! You become proof that people can change!" "What?" The sergeant sat down, his shoulders shaking with sobs. Hiroshi watched this and felt something shift inside him. Not acceptance, not forgiveness, but the beginning of understanding. That maybe the choice wasn't between honor and shame. Maybe the choice was between clinging to a lie and accepting the truth, between dying for a cause that never existed and living to prevent it from happening again. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. The repatriation of Japanese prisoners of war was one of the most complex operations of the post-war period. Unlike German and Italian prisoners, many of whom chose to stay in America or return home to rebuild, Japanese prisoners faced a unique dilemma. They were returning to a country that had been indoctrinated to see them as traitors. In Japan, the shame of surrender was so ingrained that families would hold funerals for sons who had been captured, declaring them dead even if they were alive. Women whose husbands were prisoners would sometimes commit suicide rather than face the disgrace. The social stigma was so severe that many prisoners feared returning home more than they had feared death in battle. The American military understood this, and so, in an unprecedented move, they created a re-education program for Japanese POWs. Not brainwashing, not propaganda, but an honest attempt to deprogram them, to show them that surrender didn't have to mean death, that prisoners of war were protected by international law, that the values they had been taught, while deeply rooted in Japanese culture, had been twisted by militarism into something monstrous. Hiroshi was selected to participate in one of these programs. For 6 months, he attended classes taught by Japanese-American instructors. They taught him about the Geneva Convention, about democracy, about the history of how Japanese militarism had risen in the 1930s and consumed the country, about how the emperor had been used as a symbol to justify atrocities. At first, Hiroshi resisted. He saw it as an attempt to destroy his identity, to turn him into an American puppet. But slowly, as the evidence mounted, as the lies were exposed one by one, he began to see it differently. One instructor, a man named Dr. Kenji Takahashi, a professor who had left Japan in 1933 to escape the rising militarism, told the class, "Bushido is not the problem. The samurai code of honor has existed for centuries and has produced great men. The problem is what the military did to Bushido. They took a philosophy about personal integrity, about loyalty, about self-sacrifice for a worthy cause, and they twisted it into a death cult. They made you believe that dying was more important than living, that surrender was worse than genocide, that honor meant blind obedience rather than moral courage." He paused, looking at each prisoner. The real warriors, the real samurai, were the ones who questioned, who thought critically, who understood that honor means doing what's right, even when it's hard. What you were taught wasn't Bushido. It was a perversion of it. And you were the victims of that perversion as much as anyone else. Those words stayed with Hiroshi because they gave him something he desperately needed, a way to reconcile his past with his present, a way to honor his culture without honoring the lies that had been built on top of it. In December 1945, Hiroshi boarded a ship bound for Japan. He carried with him a small bag of belongings, a certificate of repatriation, and a letter from Captain Foster that read, "To whom it may concern." Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto served his time as a prisoner of war with dignity and integrity. He participated fully in our re-education programs and demonstrated a willingness to learn and grow. He should be welcomed home as a man who survived an impossible situation with his humanity intact. Hiroshi didn't know if the letter would help, but he kept it anyway, because it was proof that someone, somewhere, had seen him as human, even when he couldn't see himself that way. They called it captivity. But for many Japanese prisoners it was the first time they had been allowed to think. In the Japanese military, thinking was discouraged. You didn't question orders, you didn't debate strategy, you certainly didn't criticize your superiors. You obeyed, and if obedience meant death, you died. That was the system. But in American camps, prisoners were encouraged, sometimes required, to think critically, to read newspapers, to discuss ideas, to question the propaganda they had been fed. It was disorienting, terrifying, and for some, liberating. Hiroshi thought about this often in the months before his repatriation. He remembered his time in the Japanese army, the endless drills, the beatings for minor infractions, the constant threat of punishment for any hint of independent thought. He remembered officers who would strike soldiers for showing weakness, for asking questions, for being anything other than perfect machines of war. And now, in this American camp, he was being asked his opinion about the war, about the emperor, about what kind of Japan he wanted to return to. It was bizarre, as if his opinion mattered, as if he was a person, not just a number. One evening Hiroshi sat with a group of prisoners in the rec hall, listening to a radio broadcast. The program was in Japanese, but it was broadcast from San Francisco, a Japanese language station that discussed news, culture, and the ongoing rebuilding of Japan. The host was interviewing a Japanese-American soldier who had served in the 422nd Infantry Regiment, a unit made up entirely of Japanese Americans, many of whom had family members in internment camps while they fought for America. The soldier was talking about his experiences, about fighting for a country that didn't trust him, about proving his loyalty through blood and sacrifice. One prisoner, a man named Kenji, captured on Okinawa, said bitterly, "He's a traitor, fighting for the enemy." But Takeshi shook his head. Is he? Or is he just a man trying to prove he belongs somewhere? That he's more than what people say he is? He abandoned Japan. Japan abandoned him, Takeshi shot back. Japan abandoned all of us. We were told to die for the emperor, but the emperor didn't die for us. We were told to fight for our families, but our families will disown us when we return. We were told we were fighting for honor, but there was no honor in what we did. So tell me, who's the traitor? The man who fights for a country that treats him with dignity, or the men who followed orders that led to genocide? The room fell silent, because Takeshi had said what they were all thinking but were too afraid to voice. Hiroshi looked around at the faces of his fellow prisoners, men who had once been soldiers, warriors, the sword of the emperor, and now they were just men, broken, confused, trying to make sense of a world that had turned upside down. And maybe that was the point. Maybe being broken was the first step to being rebuilt, not as soldiers, but as human beings. The irony was almost too much to bear. They had been captured, defeated, imprisoned, and in that defeat they had found something they never had in victory: freedom. The freedom to think, to question, to be more than what they had been told to be. Hiroshi Yamamoto returned to Japan in January 1946. The country he found was unrecognizable. Tokyo was ashes. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were wastelands. The emperor had renounced his divinity. The military was disbanded. Everything that had defined Japan for the past 15 years was gone. Hiroshi went to his family's home in Kyoto, hoping to find someone, anyone. The house was still standing, a miracle in a city that had been bombed repeatedly. But when he knocked on the door, his mother opened it, looked at him, and said nothing. "Mother," Hiroshi said, "I've come home." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You should have died." The words hit him like a physical blow. But Hiroshi didn't cry. He didn't argue. He just nodded and said, "I know you think that, but I'm alive, and I'm trying to figure out what that means." His mother closed the door in his face. Hiroshi stood there for a moment, then turned and walked away. He didn't know where he was going. He just walked through the streets of Kyoto, past temples and gardens and buildings that had survived the war, past people who looked at him with suspicion, with disgust, with the knowledge that he was one of the dead who had refused to stay dead. Eventually he found himself at a small temple on the outskirts of the city. The monk there, an old man with kind eyes, invited him in, offered him tea, and didn't ask questions. Hiroshi stayed at the temple for 3 months, working as a laborer, helping to rebuild, trying to find some sense of purpose. And slowly, over time, he began to understand something that Captain Foster had tried to tell him: that honor wasn't about dying. It was about living, about making choices that reflected who you wanted to be, not who you had been told to be, about building something new from the ruins of something old. In 1948, Hiroshi opened a small carpentry shop in Kyoto. He never married. He never had children. He just worked, building furniture, teaching apprentices, living quietly, honestly, with the knowledge that he had survived when he wasn't supposed to, and that survival meant something. Years later, an American journalist visited Japan to write a book about POWs. She tracked down Hiroshi and asked him what he remembered most about his time in the American camp. Hiroshi thought for a long moment. Then he said, "I remember the food, not because it was good, but because I couldn't believe they were feeding us at all. I expected to die. I expected torture. I expected them to treat us the way we had been told they would. But they didn't. And that broke something in me, because it forced me to see that everything I had believed was a lie. And once you see that, you can't unsee it." He paused, his hands folded in his lap. "I came to America as a soldier. I left as a man who understood that the real enemy was never the Americans. It was the system that taught us to hate, the ideology that taught us that death was better than life, the lies that made us believe we were fighting for something noble when we were really just killing for a man's ego." Hiroshi Yamamoto died in 1992 at the age of 78. He was buried in a small cemetery in Kyoto. His grave marker read, "Hiroshi Yamamoto, carpenter, a man who survived." He left Japan as a soldier. and returned as a man who understood that survival isn't shame, it's courage. There is a lesson here, a lesson about what happens when you teach people that death is more honorable than life. The Japanese military's approach to prisoners of war, both their own and the enemy's, was rooted in a fundamental dehumanization. If a soldier could surrender, he was weak. If a soldier could be captured, he was worthless. If an enemy could be defeated, he wasn't worthy of mercy. This philosophy didn't just cost lives, it cost humanity. It turned men into machines. It made cruelty not just acceptable but expected. It created a system where the greatest virtue was obedience and the greatest sin was survival. And thousands of men died because of it, not in battle, but in camps, in death marches, in ships that should have carried them to safety, but instead became floating coffins. They died because a system had convinced an entire nation that prisoners weren't human, that mercy was weakness, that the only honorable death was the one you chose yourself. But the Japanese POWs who survived, who were captured and held in American camps, learned something different. They learned that survival isn't weakness, that mercy isn't a flaw, that treating people with dignity, even when they don't deserve it, is the foundation of civilization. And when they returned to Japan, many of them became advocates for change. They spoke out against militarism. They taught their children that honor means questioning, not obeying. They helped build a Japan that was different from the one they had left, a Japan that valued life over death, peace over war, democracy over dictatorship. It wasn't easy, it wasn't quick, but it happened because people changed, because men like Hiroshi chose to live with the shame rather than die with false honor, because they understood that the real courage isn't in dying for a cause. It's in living to make sure the cause was worth it in the first place. History doesn't repeat itself. It waits for those who forget to listen. And right now, in a world where nationalism is rising again, where death cults are recruiting young people with promises of glory and purpose, where people are being taught that dying for a cause is more important than living for a future, the story of Japanese POWs is more important than ever, because it reminds us that the most dangerous ideology isn't the one that tells you to hate, it's the one that tells you that your life doesn't matter, that you're only valuable if you're willing to die, that survival is weakness and sacrifice is strength. Hiroshi understood this, Takeshi understood this, and the thousands of Japanese prisoners who chose life over death understood this. They learned it the hard way, through shame and suffering and the slow, painful process of unlearning everything they had been taught. But they learned it. And because they learned it, Japan became better. Not perfect, not healed, but better. And maybe that's all we can ever hope for, that in the middle of the lies, someone tells the truth, that in the middle of the death cult, someone chooses life, that in the middle of the madness, someone realizes that survival isn't shame, it's the first step toward becoming human again. There are more stories like this one, stories of men who chose life when everything told them to choose death, stories of prisoners who found humanity in the most unexpected places. If this matters to you, if you believe we need to remember what happens when ideology values death over life, subscribe to Warden of War. The archive opens every week, and every story is a reminder that survival is always worth it. Which story should we open next? Tell us in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. We especially want to hear from anyone whose family was affected by these events. How did the post-war generation deal with these stories? What did your grandparents tell you? Share this with someone who needs to hear it, especially young people who are being told that dying for a cause makes them heroes. Because the most dangerous lie isn't that you should hate someone, it's that your death matters more than your life, and the only way to fight that lie is to keep telling stories about people who survived.